Thank you very much, James. And I think, Linda, you're going to share slides. There they are. So nice to see everybody. I can see from the list of people and also from the pictures that there's some people that I recognise and who took part in the surveys or helped children, carers and birth parents take part. So thank you to you. Thank you to Liam for organising today, and to Nuffield and the other donor for funding the study. So Linda, do you want to move on? Thank you. So as James said, since 2014, we've been following all 1,836 children who became looked after in Scotland in 2012-13 when they were aged 5 and under. And I guess we're looking at permanence, but just to flag up, because sometimes when people use the term permanence, they often using it as a shorthand for permanence away from home. So I guess in Scotland, there are 4 routes to permanence for care experienced children. So first route is remaining with or being reunified to parents. The second route is living with family. The third route is permanence orders, and the fourth route is adoption. And the focus of our study is children who are living apart from birth parents. Now, one of the things that we mention in the report, and that I want to mention here just now, is about the importance of language. I've just used the term birth parents. That's a contested term because most parents whose children aren't living with them would just use parents without the prefix birth. So in the report, we've been really careful, or tried to be as careful as we can about language. But I guess just to flag that up while I'm here. When we're thinking about permanence, we want to differentiate between legal permanence and felt permanence. So there might be some children who are legally permanent, but it might feel a bit wobbly. They might not necessarily feel permanent. And conversely, there are other children who have been living with family for a long time, for example, on Section 25 of the Children's Scotland Act, which is the equivalent of Section 20 in England, who aren't legally permanent but might feel secure. The first few slides that we're going to look at are going to be drawn from the administrative data, and that focuses primarily on legal permanence because that's what it can do. Okay, Linda, do you want to move on? And just skip over that one. That's just to let you know who's in the research team. So what we wanted to find out in phase 2 of the study was where are children? What's the permanent status? It's a longitudinal study, so at the end of phase 1, approximately a third of children were not in placements that were intended to be permanent. And we wanted to find out, well, are they there now? And if so, how long did it take them to get there? We wanted to find out, how are they doing? How are they getting on? How are the relationships? How are they getting on at school? And what are the connections that they have with people who are important but they don't live with, particularly with parents and siblings? And what are the sources of support, either that have been helpful or that they would have ideally liked? Linda, do you want to move on? Thank you. So in terms of building up a picture of children's lives, it's a mixed method study. So we've got breadth and depth. So we've drawn on administrative data, on surveys and on interviews. One of the brilliant bits of having the administrative data is it gives us lots of information about our children. However, sometimes we can forget that administrative data is information about children's lives. So we're going to bring children in today in a couple of ways. One of the things that you'll notice, not on this slide because there's not room for it, but on all of the other slides, there's shoes. And those shoes represent our cohort. So they go from really tiny shoes to great big shoes. And they give a sense of who's in our cohort. But we're also going to play some recordings. So we've taken some of the extracts from transcripts from children, and we've voiced those with children known to the research team. So again, that brings them into the study. It brings them into today. Linda, do you want to move on? Should say, you don't need to madly write things down. We're going to send out the slides. And what we've tried to do today is to give you a sense of some of the key findings. but we've only got 25 minutes, so we can't do justice to everything. So I'd really, really encourage you to go and have a look at the report. We've put the QR code on the first slide. Yeah, so we'll pull out some of the key things from today. So where were they? So by the end of July 2022, 10 years after becoming looked after in 2012, 2013, 79% of our children were living in homes intended to be permanent, which is good news. However, it took on average 32 months, so that's almost 3 years. Now, 3 years isn't that much time in my life, but for children, that's a huge amount of time. So looking at the shoes, you can imagine how many shoe sizes a child would go through in 3 years. And that was one of the findings that's been picked up in the Scottish Parliament. 12% were still or again in impermanent placements. And again, that's a huge number of children who are not in placements that are intended to be permanent. Almost half of the children were looked after via Section 25, and some of them had been there for 5 years or more. Interestingly, boys more than girls were more likely to be in impermanent placements, and 64% of children had 2 or more placements. But I guess the really significant fact bit here is 1 in 10 had 5 or more. Now, there's 64 of us in the room just now. So that means that if we were those children, at least 6 of us would have moved round 5 times. That's a lot of children. Do you want to move on, Linda? And Ben talks about his memories about moving.
When I was younger, nobody was telling me what was going on, just moving me, almost like a piece on the chessboard. Just leave him there for now, or take him back. No, move him here, but without saying anything, so it was just about a bit like, you're here now.
Now, Ben draws a parallel between being a piece on a chessboard, but he's not. He's a child. So each of those moves involves a change of bedroom. It involved a change of carer. It might have involved changing schools. Not knowing whether in this house you flush the loo when you go in the middle of the night, or whether you can just go to the fridge. So all those changes. And later on in his interview, he talked about what that meant for him in terms of his relationships in the here and now. Linda, do you want to move on? Because one of the things that came up is that the decisions that were made really early in children's lives are crucial, not just at the time, but years and years later. So one of the things that we found was most significant was a combination of the age at which children first became looked after and the first placement. And that was associated with where and with whom they were living by the end of July 2022. So children who were under a year old when they became looked after, and particularly those children who were under 6 weeks, were more likely to be adopted, whereas children aged 4 years and over were more likely to be living with parents or on a permanence order. And I guess one of the things that we're going to look at later on this morning is that where you are living has significant implications for whether you have contact with brothers and sisters, and also whether you have contact with both parents. So I guess one of the questions that we had is about how practitioners and other decision makers are properly supported in that early decision making phase. Linda, do you want to move on? And I think this is you now.
It is, yes. So as Helen's mentioned, the longitudinal nature of the class administrative data is a real strength and was real strength for our study. And it enabled us to look at children's pathways across a long period of time. So this figure is called a Sankey diagram. And on the vertical axis, we have the number of cohort children living in each type of placement at the end of July in each year of the study, which is shown along the bottom. And the key indicates the colour coding of the different placement types. And overall, the figure shows that most changes happen during the first 4 or 5 years after children in the cohort became looked after. And after that time, the heights of the different coloured bars sort of stabilise. But the Sankey also shows diagonal lines, which represent children who move between placements of different types during each year. And we can see these diagonal lines all across the figure, which shows that despite overall increasing stability in children's placements over the years, there are still children who are moving between placements of different types close to 10 years after first becoming looked after. And this second figure shows the time taken to achieving permanence for children living in placements intended to be permanent around 10 years after they first became looked after. And again, the horizontal line is time, but here the vertical axis shows the proportion of children not in a permanent placement at any given time. So the coloured lines go down as more children enter placements intended to be permanent. And as Helen's already mentioned, the average time to permanence was 32 months, over 2.5 years. And this varied by the type of permanence. So the blue line represents children unified to parents. These children tended to enter the permanent placement fastest, so the line drops first. And the grey line is children with permanence order, and they tended to enter permanent placements the slowest. But what this figure shows is that there's a long tail of children who are achieving permanence many years after first becoming looked after. Even for those who are unified to parents, around 10% of children only did so 5 or more years after they were first looked after. And this sort of goes against conventional thinking that if children don't go home early, then they're unlikely to go home. And it leads to questions about the type of support that families will need. So we've been looking so far at children's pathways, drawing primarily on the administrative data. And we now turn to consider children's wellbeing, how they're getting on at home, with peers, at school. And in this section, we draw mainly on survey and interview data, which gives us that breadth, but also drills down to give us that real depth of understanding. And one aspect of children's wellbeing is physical and mental health. And we collected information on children's health from caregivers in the survey when children were aged between about 8 and 13 years old. Caregivers completing questionnaires were asked whether children had been diagnosed or were undergoing assessment for any long-standing illnesses, disabilities or health conditions, and over 2/3 had. The presence of multiple conditions was common, with 10% of children diagnosed with 4 or more health problems or disabilities. And overall, the proportion of children in the caregiver survey with 1 or more long-standing illness, disability or health condition had more than doubled since phase 1. Over 1/3 of the children were said to have a long-standing condition that affected their day-to-day activities, a measure of disability. And this was more than double that seen amongst 14-year-olds in a recent representative Growing Up in Scotland study. So in phase 1, the most commonly reported disabilities and health issues were learning difficulties for 9%, and visual, hearing or speech problems for 13% of children in the caregiver sample. This graph shows the percentage of children who've been diagnosed or were currently being assessed for different conditions in phase 2. And the most commonly reported condition was visual impairment, which had been diagnosed for almost 1/4 of children. And 3 of these children also experienced hearing difficulties. 5 children in the interview sample had a visual impairment, and the impact on their lives ranged from very little to needing some additional support in school to a significant need for support across all environments. Learning disability and difficulties, ADHD, were common, each affecting at least 1 in 5 children in the caregiver survey, although sizable proportions of these children were still waiting for a formal diagnosis. And in phase 1, a negligible proportion of children had been diagnosed with drug and alcohol related disorders. But by phase 2, 14% of children had been diagnosed with 1 or more of these conditions, with a further 8% undergoing assessment. Children's emotional well-being is really hard to measure. But one way in which children express the stress and trauma is through their behaviour. And as in phase one, the caregiver survey included the commonly used standardised measure, the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, or SDQ. And this consists of 25 questions that together give an indication of whether a child is likely to have emotional and behavioural problems. We found that half of the 98 children whose caregivers completed the questionnaire did have SDQ scores indicating likely difficulties. And this was 5 times higher than seen in the general population of children, and almost double that seen in phase one. To give a sense of children's relationships with caregivers, the questionnaire also included the Relationships Problems Questionnaire, or RPQ. And overall, 3 in 10 of our children had RPQ scores indicating possible problems with relationships and attachments. And this is a slight increase from phase one, when it was 25% of children. And as in phase one, one factor which had a significant association with high RPQ scores was whether children had a disability. And that the proportion of children with likely emotional and behavioural difficulties is higher than in phase one, maybe because children are now feeling more secure, because caregivers have a better sense of children and their needs, but it may also be because as children develop, the gap between them and their peers has increased. And what these findings do highlight is a sense of the level of ongoing support that children and their caregivers are likely to need from a variety of sources, irrespective of who the children are living with or their legal status. Back to you.
Thanks. So Linda mentioned support, and from interviews, what came up was that although children's networks were expanding, caregivers were the primary support and played a really important role in advocating for children, and became experts in navigating incredibly complex systems. One of the other findings that came up in terms of support was that although lots of children didn't have regular social work contacts, it had been important following difficult periods for some families and some children. Life storybooks were mentioned by social workers who completed surveys, but they were also came up as really important in interviews and were often the things that children went to get when they wanted to talk about some of the things that they'd experienced previously. Linda, do you want to move on? So I guess one of the things that came up, unsurprisingly given children's ages, was the significance of school. And after caregivers, children mentioned teachers as the people that they would turn to first for support. And what helped children was where teachers and schools built on their interests, where children had agency about when and where to seek support, and about teachers acknowledging diversity, so not assuming that all families looked the same, and having peer interventions that included other children, and having whole class interventions. Okay, Linda. So although school was a place of support for lots of children, we also heard that it was a place of exclusion. And I guess one of the things to flag up is that the report from the Independent Care Review, The Promise, highlighted that Scotland mustn't exclude care experienced children or reduce timetable to such an extent that they're denied the right to education. Now, one of the things that we looked at, so we had some education data on approximately 750 of our children, and what that showed us was that although formal exclusion was really rare, informal exclusion was not so rare, and came up during a number of interviews and had significant implications for children and for the caregivers. We also saw some examples from interviews and also from surveys of some punitive or inflexible responses within education. And for some children, Linda talked about children's additional needs, and for some children, extracurricular activities were accessible for them. And interestingly, or well, we thought it was interesting, in none of the interviews and in none of the surveys did anyone mention the role of the virtual school head. Linda, do you want to move on? I think that's you now.
So the promise in Scotland set out the need for whole family support, including for kinship, foster and adoptive families. And this graph shows the sources of support that caregivers in the survey said they had received help or advice from in the previous year. The blue bars show the proportion of foster carers receiving support from a particular source, orange is kinship carers, and green represents adoptive parents. And overall, caregivers were most likely to receive support from their partner, from friends and neighbours, other relatives, teachers or school staff, and from social workers. And in phase one, we saw differences in the extent and types of support that kinship carers, foster carers, and adoptive parents accessed. And then adoptive families were more likely to draw on informal sources of support, such as extended family and friends, whereas foster carers were more likely to draw on support from formal services provided by social workers and third sector organisations. Kinship carers and the children in their care tended to receive lower levels of support from both formal and informal sources. And in phase two, you can see here that there continue to be differences between the three groups. More kinship carers reported receiving formal support from social workers compared to phase one, but overall they continued to receive less support than foster carers and adoptive parents from most sources. So our data suggests that kinship carers, the support needs of kinship carers and the children they care for are at times different to those of foster carers and adoptive parents. Although kinship carers access less support overall, we had a sense that in some families it was not necessarily because support wasn't available, but because carers didn't fully trust that the way support would be delivered or the person delivering it might be as attuned and sensitive as needed. And here we have a picture of an eggshell, and you'll be aware of eggshells in your own families and where not to tread. Kinship carers and birth parents are navigating really complex relationships, often when they live close by. And some caregivers were uncertain that services would always be as sensitive to the nuances of family dynamics, and were reluctant to access support that might change dynamics and lead to children feeling less secure.
Thank you. One of the things that we tussled over when we were writing the report was the word instructive. And I guess one of the things that came up from surveys and interviews was that where support was kind of off the shelf rather than nuanced, that wants are helpful for children, for caregivers or for birth parents. And unsurprisingly, caregivers who'd had past negative experiences were really hesitant to contact social work or mental health professionals again. Social workers who completed the survey, approximately 19% of them identified the impact that vacancies and resource constraints had in terms of their capacity to offer support and to offer support that was nuanced and available when carers wanted it. And caregivers and children were also aware of that context, but flagged up the significant impact that that had on them. Linda, do you want to move on, please? In terms of what was helpful, similar to most other studies, in terms of what's helpful is support that's based on relationships, that's sensitive, empathic and responsive. So the kind of support that you and I would want, and that's timely and flexible. And where the really emotional labour that's involved in caring is recognised, one of the things that struck us during interviews was that emotional labour that caregivers were involved in terms of how hard it was to care for some of the children. Linda, do you want to move on, please? The birth parents who took part in interviews were unusual in the sense that all of them were accessing support, and we know that that's not what happens for all birth parents. One of the things that they identified was the stickability of social workers in permanence teams was really appreciated, and some birth parents talked about social workers who had literally saved their lives. Many of them identified gaps in support, particularly for brothers and sisters who were at home and who couldn't quite understand why the sibling wasn't also at home. The interviews were hard to do. So Ariane did the interviews, and the interviews were hard to listen to as a social worker, because one of the things that came out was that most of them had felt disrespected by their children's social workers at least once. And years later, birth parents hadn't always had a clear explanation about the legal or permanent status of the children, or about changes in contact. Linda, do you want to move on? I think this is you.
Yeah. So we turn now to look at the contact and connections that children in the study had with important people who they didn't live with. And the promise in Scotland, we focused policy and practice on the value placed in sibling relationships. And there's been a series of amendments to legislation, to guidance. Other studies have demonstrated that siblings often are separated, and decisions made early on are really important. In phase 2 of permanent progressing, we had responses from 213 social workers who've had recent contact with children, and the majority of children did have brothers and sisters, and over 80%, 4 out of 5, were living apart from at least one sibling. Just over half of children whose siblings lived elsewhere had some form of contact, meaning that almost half did not. And whether children have any form of contact with brothers and sisters varied according to where they lived. This was higher for children in foster or kinship care, but just a quarter of adopted children had some form of contact with siblings they didn't live with. And we saw a similar picture in the information reported by caregivers in the survey. Of 79 children with a sibling living elsewhere, around half had some form of contact with one of their siblings in the previous year. And this figure shows the type and frequency of contact children had with brothers and sisters. The length of the light blue bar, which indicates the number of children who did not have that kind of contact, is really stark. For around half of the 41 children who had some form of contact with siblings living elsewhere, caregivers reported that this was at least monthly. For 12 of these children, contact of any type with siblings was on a daily or weekly basis. Spending time together happened less often, while phone, text, social media contacts occurred more frequently. Helen, back to you.
I guess the kind of key words on this slide are that connections and contact varied depending on children's status and with whom they lived. So what the words that are out there is that it depended on children's needs. So I guess one of the things that we found was that formal and managed family time in foster families and foster carers was as you'd anticipate, better supported by social workers. In kinship families, connections were much more dynamic, and there were some real benefits to that in terms of that they were able to change depending upon children's needs. But there were also some complexities in managing those. And there were instances where the type of contact varied from what was kind of written down. Far less contact in adoptive families, and the most common form of contact between adopted children and birth parents is letterbox. And I guess one of the things that's come out over the last couple of weeks is the Public Law Working Group Adoption Subgroup Report that flags up that the system of letterbox is outdated. And I guess one of the things that really struck us from interviews and from surveys was that how significant that contact was, and how limited the support on offer for that was. Where birth parents were supported, it made a real difference in terms of whether they were able to continue writing those letters. I guess the other thing that came up was that the improved circumstances in birth family weren't always reflected in changes in contact, and that was really frustrating for them. Do you want to move on? So these are some of the extracts on Letterbox. Linda, do you want to play Lucas?
I don't know what to say to them, if I'm being honest. It's been so long, there's not... At least if it was someone I'd seen somewhat recently, I could have something, a talking point or some information, but I haven't.
So Lucas was one of the few children who was involved in writing and reading the letters. And you get a sense from him of how difficult that is. And similarly, in terms of Claire, you get a sense of how thoughtfully people write letters, not mentioning, I don't refer to myself as mum and dad. We talk about Nate regularly goes to his granny. I don't say he goes to his granny and granddad. I watch how I word things. And from Debbie, the significance of receiving letters about them being hard and emotional, that although it helps, that those are hard letters to get. Linda, do you want to move on? In terms of connections with birth parents, the lack of in-person contact in adoptive families might, on the surface, appear fixed, but it came up in most of the interviews that we did as something that both children and caregivers were given a lot of thought to, and children expressed a range of feelings about making contact, including curiosity. And here you can hear from Leah.
At times, I can feel like I want to contact them, and other times I don't want to contact any of them. It's an interesting position. It's a contrast of emotions, considering. Sometimes I feel bad for them, sometimes you're angry. It's an interesting dilemma, really. I personally don't want to ruin my life here just for contact that could die and nothing happens, make things worse. At some point, I will definitely contact them. There's no doubt about that. It's just when the time is right.
So I think you get a sense from Leah about the amount of thought that she's putting into when's right for me. And another young person talked about making contact once she got school out of the way. I guess one of the difficulties that struck us was that because in lots of the adopted families that we spoke to, there weren't any ongoing social work contact. It was hard to make those changes. Could you want to move on, Linda? Okay, so we said at the beginning that we were going to use, that we were trying to, the aim of the study was to use different forms of data to build up a picture. The last page of the report, we've used Dylan's words, and we're going to kind of end with Dylan here today about how he talks about his puzzle.
This is a lot of stuff that I've been told later on by Jeff and Ali, my brother's carers and my brother. So yes, it's been a lot of piecing the puzzle together. It's quite a broken puzzle, but someday it'll be complete.
And I guess in terms of two things for you, one of the things that just having to think about just now, but also during the rest of the day, or when you're walking the dog, or whatever you're doing later on, is thinking in terms of what are the two things that have stuck with you about what you've heard, and as a consequence, what might you do more of or less of? And I think that's us finished.